His partner Erskine Hazard had an unfortunate name for a boat, so we went with Josiah White. Erskine Hazard, maybe not such a great name for a boat. I'm Captain Doug. I'll be your narrator for the next 45 minutes here on the Lehigh Coal and Navigation System. We are waiting for a couple of people who are currently making their way down the towpath, so we're going to be a little delayed in leaving, but that should only be a couple of moments. Now, the Lehigh Coal and Navigation System was known as a navigation system because the entire 47-mile ride between Easton and Mauch Chunk, which today is the city of Jim Thorpe, was made not just on canal, but also on open and navigable river water. You would navigate from one of 8 sections of canal out onto one of 9 sections of river, join up with the next section of canal, move on up to the end of that, and then get back out on the river going up north or coming back down south with your full load. There are a couple of safety announcements I'm required to make before we leave. This boat is in fact regulated by the U.S. Coast Guard. We are on a wooden boat, so no open flames on board the boat at any time. We are riding on the last steel hull created by the Bethlehem Steel shipyard down in Maryland. That shipyard brought up our hull in 3 pieces, welded it all together, and then a wooden boat was built on top by the shipbuilders. So we do have a nice steel ashtray to return to the dock in case anybody lights up on the way, but we'd like to avoid that if at all possible. You are allowed to walk around during our ride. There are 4 times during which you are required to be seated: when we leave the dock, when we return to the dock at the end of our ride, and during each of our 2 180-degree turns on the canal. Sometimes things can be a little unusual. Once in a while we'll bump a towpath or something along the way, and during those maneuvers we like everybody to be seated just to make sure you're all safe and nobody loses their balance. If you are walking around during the ride and you find you need support, please use a wooden post or an iron pole. The ropes have a tendency to give, and it's very easy to end up on the wet side. We'd like to avoid that as well. If you should fall into the canal, we are trained in rescue and safety techniques, so we'll come and get you, but I've warned you now, so I'm going to make fun of you first. Should you fall down in there, you might be one of our canaligators. Canaligator is the name that one of our crewmates gave the very, very large snapping turtles that live along the shores of our canal. I've seen them with heads bigger than my fist, and you don't want to meet one of those up close in the water. So we'd like to keep everybody safe and dry and on board. I will welcome questions while we're underway. If anybody has any questions while we're underway, please feel free to raise your hand. I'll try and answer your questions as best I can. Our wayward passengers are almost here, so we should be getting ready to go. Now, our boat is similar to, but differently shaped than period canal boats. This boat was built for passenger safety, so it is wider and shorter than the boats in period. Those boats, 87 feet long, we're about 32 feet longer than this boat. We are 22.5 feet wide. This boat was built to just the right width to fit into a lock at either end, which were originally built to accommodate 2 boats side by side. Those boats back in period were only 10.5 feet wide. Very long, very narrow. Their upper deck had no benches on top, no canvas top above, no ropes around the sides. Their deck was open to the elements, and their upper deck was lined with hatch covers that lay flat to the deck. Those could be opened up, all your cargo would be loaded down below, and then the hatch covers would be closed up, and the captain, standing back at the tiller, had a clear view ahead of their boat, their mules and mule tenders, and any boats that might be traveling in their direction so that they could safely maneuver around them. The one thing that we are is as high off the water as an unladen boat would have been in period. Fully laden, a 20-ton wooden boat would sink down into the water about 5.5 feet. So we were riding as high as an empty boat, but once you loaded your boat up, it would sink down about 5.5 feet into the water. Like period boats, this boat has no motor, no engine, no track hidden under the water. The only way we go is by mule power. And that's our twin turbo engines right out there. That's George in the front being led by Bobby and Hank in the back being led by Sarah. They are going to be the means of motivation for our boat during our ride. Now, our boat, because of that steel hull, weighs a little more than the all-wooden boats back in period. It weighs 48 tons, 96,000 pounds. If you're worried about the weight that the boys are about to pull, I'll ask you to take a look at Leanne and Sarah standing at the side of the boat. Sarah's just attached our 120-foot-long tow line to the tow bar at the back of Hank's harness. And now Sarah and Leanne are going to disengage our midline ties. That's what attaches us to the dock. And once they've got those coiled up and laid on board, they're going to engage in what sailors would call shoving off. Shoving off is a nautical term, and it refers literally to leaning against the side of the boat to push it away from the dock so we can then safely get underway. So if anybody's ever told you to shove off, maybe they're a sailor, we don't know. Either way, if two people can push a 96,000-pound boat sideways through the water, a direction this boat was not designed to go, you can guarantee that a couple of 1,100-pound mules are going to have no trouble pulling this boat forward through the water. It was, in fact, Benjamin Franklin, who was ambassador to France back in the 1700s, who studied the French canal systems while he was there. He believed that canals were the way forward for America, a way to open up the countryside, make it easier to transport heavy goods and services back and forth between the cities and the slowly expanding countryside. He did mathematical equations that had him realize that a single adult mule can move up to 65 tons as long as that weight is on open water. Because of the lack of friction on the water, boats similar to this one but different in shape were the ideal way to move heavy, bulky cargo in a time before we had any motorized transport to do that work. Hank and George are walking out to the end of their tow line. Once they get there, they're going to stop short and lean into the heavy leather collars around their necks and up against their chests. Because they're joined together by heavy leather straps called traces, they pull together on the weight of the boat. And with a little bit of a tug, we've just broken inertia and we've started moving downstream. Shortly, the boys will get up to their natural walking pace, a pace they'd be walking whether they were joined to a boat or not, and our maximum cruising speed of 2 miles an hour. Now, I know 2 miles an hour doesn't sound very fast, but you have to realize in the time when these canals were built, the largest land vehicle available for moving any kind of bulky cargo was a Conestoga wagon. Originated in Conestoga, Pennsylvania, they'd be 18 to 25 feet long, about 8 or 10 feet wide, 4 big wheels on them. They could be loaded with 8 or 10 tons of cargo, but it would take up to a dozen horses, mules, or oxen to pull them on roads that were all dirt, often rutted, often muddy. If anything fell across that road, there was no PennDOT to clear the road for you. It was up to you to figure out how to move a fallen branch or tree. Their maximum cruising speed would likely be about 1 mile an hour. Boats like this one could be loaded with 100 tons of cargo, 10 times more than what you could get on a wagon, and it took only 2 mules to pull that weight because of the lack of friction on the water. So this was definitely the way you wanted to go if you had access to a canal. Now, Hank and George, they've been working here for 18 years. They're the longest working set of mules we've ever had. Mules typically have a lifespan that takes them up to about 35 years, and they can live as long as 50 and even older. So these guys are just about into their middle ages right now. We expect another 5 to 6 years of work out of them before, just like people, they start getting sore and they start developing arthritis. It'll be time for them to retire. And when it is time for them to retire, they'll be retired as a pair to a small farm up in Williams Township where they spend every winter. This canal, because of the slow-moving water, was in danger of being damaged if you left it full of water in the winter time. So at the end of November every year, they would drain the entire canal dry. So that way, ice that formed on the surface of the water could never damage the banks or the bed of the canal, and they'd leave it dry until the spring thaw in late March, early April, when it would be refilled and the canaling season would begin. That canal season took you all the way through to the end of the following November, and the work day on this canal began at 4 o'clock in the morning and ended at 10 o'clock at night. 18 hours a day, 6 days a week. You'd have 2 mules out pulling each of 200 boats up and down this canal, and between this canal, the Delaware Canal, and the Morris Canal over in New Jersey, there were up to 2,000 boats operating on these canals, all moving between New York, Pennsylvania, Easton, and all the cities in between. I have to move a rope. I'll be right back. Now we're about to engage in a maneuver that could not have been performed in period. Those boats, 87 feet long, could not turn around in a canal that is on average 60 feet wide. This boat was built specifically short enough so that we could turn around, because while we have working locks at both ends of the canal, neither of those open out to the river any longer. So we have to turn around right here on the canal in order to be able to change direction. In period, if you wanted to turn around, you'd have to leave through one of those locks, turn around in a basin on the river, and then come back through the lock headed in the other direction. Captain Leanne has pushed her tiller all the way to the right to start us on a left-hand turn. You have to steer backwards on a boat. If you want to turn left, you push your tiller to the right. If you want to turn right, you pull your tiller to the left. As we go into that turn, the mule tenders are instructing the mules to walk back up the way we went. Once they get up to the end of their rope again, they'll give us a little tug, help us complete our turn. And once Leanne is happy with the position of the boat, she'll wave out to the mule tenders standing by, the mules who should be standing still at that time. And that'll be their signal to start moving on up the stream and taking us back up towards the lock tender's house, our next destination. As I mentioned, Hank and George have been here for 18 years. They are 21 and 24 years old, respectively. Mules are a hybrid species. Mules are a mix between a horse and a donkey. And the only way you can get a mule is by breeding a horse with a donkey. Mules themselves, because they're bred with two different types of animals, are born with an odd number of chromosomes and are born sterile. They're incapable of reproducing. So each generation of mules is unique. They are unique to the parents that brought them into the world. And generally speaking, the way they set things up, the mother of those two mules would be the horse. They're going to mimic their mother in size, coloring, and musculature. And Hank and George had Percheron draft mares as mothers, very large, very handsome, very heavily muscled animals, which accounts for their slightly larger than average size. Now you can reverse the process. You get good qualities from both parents. Usually, if the mother is the horse, you're going to get your size, your coloring, and your musculature from mom. From their dad, the donkey, they inherit a bunch of qualities that makes them ideal for this kind of work. Now, a lot of people look at us and say, well, if it's so hard to breed two different animals together to get this sort of an animal, why don't you just use horses? Horses are strong, they can move a boat. And the story is that actually there were horses used to move canal boats in America. Up on the Erie Canal, they used horses to pull their boats. But the problem with horses is that they are a very spirited, very filled with energy sort of an animal, and they're going to work as fast and as hard as they possibly can. Now, up on the Erie Canal, they built their boats with a stable right on board because they had to keep a second set of horses waiting on board their boat. Halfway through the day, the first set of horses pulling your boat would have pulled so fast and so hard that they'd wear themselves out. They'd be too tired to continue. So they'd have to be loaded back into the stable on board the boat. The fresh horses waiting inside would take their place on the towpath, and they'd finish your workday for you. Mules, because their father, the donkey, is a slow-paced and very steady-footed animal, learn how to pace themselves very early in life. They're not going to get you there quite as fast as a horse will, but you only need the one set of mules to complete an 18-hour workday. Because of that slow, steady pace, they will not tire themselves out or injure themselves during the workday. And because they're a breed between two different animals, they enjoy what we call hybrid vigor. They have denser bones than a horse of the same size. They are pound for pound stronger than a horse of the same size. And because their father is a donkey, a creature that originates in dry, arid regions, deserts and the like, they require less food and less drink in order to survive. They inherit that from their father, the donkey. Because they're a very steady-footed animal, they'll also never put their feet down on anything they don't know will support their weight. So while a horse might be interested in climbing into this canal to cool off on a hot summer's day, the mules will never do that. They look at the reflective surface of the water, and not knowing if it's over their hooves or over their heads, they just won't go near it. We know they avoid such surfaces because on rainy days, we'll get puddles out on the towpath, and you'll see our boys pulling the boat, walk up to a puddle, not knowing if it's over their hooves or their heads. They'll simply walk around every puddle they come to. They just don't trust it. Because they ate less and drank less, they were a more economical animal to use for this sort of work. And the men driving these boats, they only had 3 seasons out of the year to work, so they tried to save money any way they could. Canal boats were in the delivery business. You get paid for your delivery, and the faster you get your delivery to where it's going, the faster you get paid. And you want to have something in your boat moving either up or downstream. Now, the canal we're traveling on was built by hand. Canals in general were always built by hand back in the day. Men using pickaxes, shovels, axes, and the occasional wheelbarrow, maybe a donkey or a mule to help move the really heavy stuff. They didn't even have dynamite at the time. It hadn't been invented yet. So if you came across a rock too big to move, well, you'd load it up by drilling a hole into it, drop some black powder into it, and try and blow it up. If you're going to go to all the time and the trouble and the expense of building a canal, you'd better have a pretty good reason. And the reason for the building of this canal primarily was the carriage of anthracite coal. Anthracite coal discovered in the 1790s by a Dutch farmer named Philip Ginder, who was up in the Poconos looking for a millstone for his mill. He got to the top of a hill known as Mock Chunk, which is the name of the Native American name for Bear Mountain. And what he found when he got up there was not a millstone for his mill, but big black shiny rocks like that one sticking out of the hilltop. He didn't know it at the time, but Philip Ginder had just uncovered the world's largest deposit of anthracite coal. Anthracite is a very rare form of coal. It doesn't exist everywhere on Earth. There are smaller deposits in Siberia, scattered about in Europe and the UK, but Ginder had just unknowingly come across the world's largest deposit of this stuff. Anthracite differs from soft coal in a number of ways. At the time, Philadelphia was the largest city in North America and home to America's iron industry. There, they were using either wood or charcoal to heat people's homes, to cook on their stoves, or using charcoal or soft bituminous coal, a lesser grade of coal than anthracite, to fire up their iron furnaces. The problem with the soft coal is that none of it was coming from Pennsylvania. It was all being mined in southern colonies, in the Virginias and the Carolinas, sailed down rivers, put on large ships, sailed up the eastern seaboard, brought into the Delaware Basin, and sailed upriver to Philadelphia where it would be sold. It was also arriving as ballast on British ships. They would load up their boats with soft coal, sail across the Atlantic nice and safe and low in the water. Once they got here, they'd sell their coal, buy whatever they'd come for, turn around and sail home.